Hi everybody, Roman numeral 5, Asian Americans. Okay, so with Asian Americans, it's sort of like the Hispanic community in that there is a big diversity in the Asian American community as well. The difference being here is that the Asian American community tends to be a bit older than the Hispanic community in that we first had massive immigration of the Asian community starting in the late 1800s with the railroads, whereas most of the immigration in the Hispanic community has been more recent and in larger waves, whereas the Asian community has been more of a steady growth throughout. Um, as I said, the original growth of the Asian American community in the United States came about after the Civil War in the late 1870s and 80s, basically because we had colonized the western United States, but there was a large gap in the middle and we needed railroads in order to build them. The Asian community made for perfect railroad builders because we needed to blow holes in mountains, and the Chinese were A, good with dynamite, and B, worth less than a white person. I wish I was kidding. But really, that was part of the rationale. The Chinese, A, knew how to use dynamite, and B, when they blew themselves up, we didn't care as much because you could pay them for a lot less than it paid a white worker. So as a result, we encouraged Chinese and Japanese people to come over. We basically thought they were all Chinese, but not the point. We encouraged them to come over to the United States and help build the railroads, and they did, and they started building larger and larger communities out west in places like California, which is why you have areas like Chinatown and Japantown and San Francisco and Los Angeles and so forth. The problem was they came in such large numbers that it began to freak out the white people, afraid that the Asian people were going to take over. As a result, this is why you get the Chinese Exclusion Act, which you'll remember back from Unit 2 is the first law that was designed specifically to exclude a race of people, in this case Chinese people, which again really referred to all Asian people, we just really couldn't be bothered to tell the difference. So the Chinese Exclusion Act was designed to stop all Asian people from moving to the United States in the hopes that we would stop this evil takeover and so forth. The other major law or agreement that we made regarding immigration was the Gentleman's Agreement. This was a separate agreement we made with Japan. Japan was actually concerned that so many of their citizens were leaving that they actually could run out of citizens. And so they made a special agreement with the United States to essentially shut down their emigration, and we would not allow white people into Japan. That was sort of the Gentleman's Agreement. That was how we honored things for a long time. Japan actually had sort of a different attitude towards immigration than China and the other countries. Japan, as a culture, had been largely insular, and they basically had thought themselves superior to everyone else. And so when the white people came over, especially in the United States' case, when we came over with large gunships, it really confused them, and so they actually began to adopt white ways. Remember we talked about how, like, with the Indians and with the African Americans, there was a concerted effort on white people's part to convert them to being white. In the case of the Japanese and the Chinese, it really wasn't an attempt by the white people to convert the Asians. The Asian people wanted to become white. In Japan, for example, they adopted baseball as one of their sports. They adopted Western style of dress with shirt and tie and top hat. They created railroad cars and everything. They basically wanted to be like the United States. Go rent The Last Samurai starring Tom Cruise if you really want to understand a little bit more about what I'm talking about. It's not a very good movie, but it at least gives you an idea of what I'm talking about. And so this assimilation, this attempt by the Asian community to become more like the whites, led to the Asian community getting less blowback than other minority groups did. The fact that they also were, again, generally kept to themselves helped as well. And then, of course, World War II happened. When World War II happened, all the attention was put back on the Asian communities, and basically was a massive, massive problem, especially in the United States. Arguably, World War II, at least from the Japanese side, is largely a result of them adopting you as, like, trying to be white and them not getting any respect for it. But that's not my point. The whole thing is, in the United States, we became, again, paranoid once we got to war with Japan about all these Asian Americans. The concern was what we called the fifth column. We basically were concerned that Asian Americans in the United States were essentially sleeper agents, just waiting for the signal from home to strike back and destroy the United States. And that was the whole reason they'd immigrated in the first place, was to infiltrate us and destroy us. And so what we ended up doing was rounding up all Asian people in the western United States and putting them in large internment camps. Not the same as, the concentration camps in Nazi Germany, but, not too far off. Basically, we would take Asian people from their homes and move them out to these large areas in the Midwest, like Utah and Colorado and so forth. In these large communities, they would be given housing, and they would have doctors and schools, and even their own little sports teams. I swear, I wish I was kidding, but they literally had sports teams for these places. So there was designed to have a nice little community, except you couldn't leave. It was surrounded by barbed wire and large armed guards. And the premise was, we're going to keep an eye on these people so that they can't possibly be spying, but we're not like the Nazis. We're not going to beat them and kill them. We're just going to make sure they can never ever leave. Now, you might be saying to yourself that this seems horribly unconstitutional, being kicked out of your house and being forced to live in a fenced-in community, and you would probably be right. However, in the Supreme Court case of Korematsu v. U.S., the Supreme Court basically went, meh, it's a war. What are you going to do? Really, the case of Korematsu v. U.S. says that under normal circumstances, putting people in camps is a no-no, but it's a war, so in the case of a war, we're going to relax the rules just a little bit. It's not the Supreme Court's finest hour, and in fact, in later years, they kind of said, our bad, we probably shouldn't have done that. Kind of like how they said that, black people were property with the Dred Scott decision, so the Supreme Court's not perfect. But in any case, the U.S. has officially said sorry, and in 1998, we paid $1.5 billion in reparations to the survivors of the internment camps, again, as our way of saying we really, really, really shouldn't have done that. Under modern issues, as a whole, the Asian American community is generally more successful than a lot of other minority groups. Financially, educationally, and so forth, they generally rank higher than a lot of minority groups. But that actually comes as sort of a double-edged sword, that Asian Americans still face discrimination and issues just on a different level, whereas African Americans and Native Americans and Hispanic Americans are largely arguing and fighting at sort of the lower level, if you will, things like entry-level jobs and so forth. Asian Americans oftentimes find discrimination on the higher level, things like entrance exams to higher education, gated communities in wealthier neighborhoods, affirmative action cutting both ways for them and against them. And so as a result, they tend to be a bit sort of the odd duck out when it comes to minority issues, in that they are largely unaffected by most of the arguments when it comes to minority issues. Like, we don't necessarily think of them when we argue about minority issues, and yet they are still minorities. And so as a result, they oftentimes are negatively impacted, but they're just not as visibly negatively impacted because of their financial or relative financial success and relative educational success. That's about it for Asian Americans. Next up will be Roman numeral 6, and it's a long one, and we're talking about women up next. So that will be Roman numeral 6. So click on to the next one when you're ready.